Hey everybody, so I'm going to talk to you today about the Fibonacci sequence, okay? So some of you may have heard what that is, but if not, I have printed out pictures so that way I can show you guys, okay? And so that way you can see. So the Fibonacci sequence is this, right? It starts off with the number 1, right? And 1 plus 1 is 2. And then from there, it does what we call a recursive pattern, meaning that it's using the numbers from before to generate the next number, okay? So it's constantly recurring and using what has happened to go on to the next thing, right? So 1 plus 1 is 2, and then 1 plus the 2 is 3, and then 2 plus the 3 is 5, and 3 plus 5 is 8, 5 plus 8 is 13, 8 plus 13 is 21, right? 13 plus 21 is 34, then 55, and then 89. And then once you get to that point, it really escalates like super fast, right? Because you're adding the numbers that come before it. So when you add numbers like 89 and 55, your numbers are going to increase rapidly, okay? So as a visual, all right, those numbers, what we do is called represent a spiral, also known as the golden ratio, okay, which is like 1.618. So it kind of looks like this, right? So that 1 plus 1 or 1 by 1 is right here. And then they add in 1 by 2, that's 3. And then 2 plus 3 is 5. And then that's where you get the 5 by 5, right? And then 3 and the 5 makes 8. So it's 8 by 8. And then 5 plus 8 is 13. And so it's 13 by 13. So it's making what they call is like this sort of spiral pattern. And after 21 by 21, it gets big like super fast because, you know, the next number is 13 and 21, which is 34. So 34 by 34 would be huge and would go off my paper, okay? So like a 3D version of this is what looks like this shell. You might see these shells a lot of times like by the ocean and, you know, different things along those lines with animals, stuff like that. This is like the 3D version, okay? Right, where it starts super small in the middle and then gets larger and larger as it goes around and takes up more and more area. Now, snails and shells, they only get so big, to my knowledge, anyhow. So at a certain point, this stops. But the Fibonacci sequence never stops, right? Because numbers never stop either, okay? So this spiral and this sort of pattern, you can actually see everywhere in nature, okay? So I'm going to show you some pictures, right? You can see it in galaxies and how things are formed. You see it in stairwells. You can see it in the curvature of like body parts on the human body, right? With the ear and how it starts from the center. And that curve actually follows the Fibonacci sequence. Same thing with flowers, with shells, with different types of plants and even how they curl. All sorts of amazing things, right? Even in the body, right? Even just by you making a fist, right? That also follows that Fibonacci sequence, that pattern of starting at 1 and 1, and then 1 and 2, and then 3 and 5 and 8 and 13, and it keeps going and it keeps going and it keeps going. And because of that ratio, it's actually all over the human body as well. You can see the spiral pattern in the human ear. But the other cool thing is that you can see it in like the ratios of the body, right? In your hand, just from like your knuckles to your whole wrist, from your wrist to your elbow, right? All over the place. I encourage you, look it up on the internet, see all the different pictures. I am only showing you some of them, but you can look up Fibonacci sequence or the golden ratio and the human anatomy, human physiology, animals, nature, plants. It is everywhere. Okay, my favorite place that you see it, well, one of my favorite places, anyhow, is you can see it in the ocean, right? With the waves and like the centrifuge point. You can see it in faucets, right? So with faucets, when the water comes out and it's draining, right, in whirlpools, it follows that same golden ratio pattern. Also, this specific point where actually the water hits the sink, it's hard to tell in this picture, but that splatter pattern is also going out in that golden ratio spiral in the Fibonacci sequence. You can also see it kind of in this lightning strike where it hits the ground. Now, with lightning, because there's so much power, it doesn't curve super well, so it's straight. But the overall picture of it, it still follows the pattern of that Fibonacci sequence. But there's so much power in lightning that it has difficulty curving. Like, it is just going to get there, okay? All right. My other favorite place where you can see the Fibonacci sequence is in DNA, okay? So if you look at it this way, the ratios going from one strand to the next and the distances actually follow the golden ratio, right? And it's in here too with like the measurements they have, you know, let me read it again, 34 and 21, right? Those are numbers in our Fibonacci sequence and everything. And with the way they do like the measurements and the ratio, it is the exact same ratio, okay? So the reason for all of this, okay, the reason that all of these things show up in a Fibonacci sequence is because energy itself spirals in a Fibonacci sequence, okay? Energy moves that way. So that's the reason that it shows up in your body, it shows up in the stars, it shows up in nature, it shows up in water. Like in energy itself, it is spiraling, okay? And it's like recursive, or like I said, it is building upon itself, which I think is just absolutely amazing, okay? Like the fact that you can even see all of this in nature. I love being able to look at nature and see like the genius and the ingenuity of God, right? Because no way this was just like, oh, poof, and then it just all happened. Like there's so much design and intricacy and details that I love studying it and seeing how it relates to the Bible, because I know that the natural reflects the supernatural, right? Everything that we see was built by the unseen. It was built on the Word of God. So everything that we see has to be somewhere in the Bible. That is what I believe, okay? So all of those things to tell you, well, let me backtrack. One more thing I want to add with the DNA, okay? The DNA looks a little bit different because it's more 3D than a lot of the other objects, right? Even like our ears or our fists or like in flowers, they're a little bit more like 2D, right? They're a little bit like thinner, if that makes sense. More of a flattened image. So it's easier to kind of see that pattern. Like if you were looking at your hand, right? You could see like if something was drawn on it, that's a lot easier to see. But with DNA, with that energy, right, that's spiraling, the energy is actually being twisted upwards. Like it's in an upward motion. And that's why your DNA twists in kind of that double helix way, okay? So what I want to share with you about this Fibonacci sequence is that I want you to think about how God is a generational God, right? From the beginning of time, we have generations building upon generations, right? And we will be able to go further and further when we use what our previous generations have done before us, right? I have common phrases like standing on the shoulders of the giants, right? So the giants before you, you can see further when you are standing on their shoulders. And it's the same for your future generations and posterity and everything, right? You want them to be able to stand on your shoulders and look farther and see further than you were able to. And all of that is contained inside of you, right? Abraham, like in Galatians 3, it talks about how we are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise, right? So all of the faith and everything that was from, as we call Father Abraham, right? And that song is always coming, Father Abraham had many sons, right? So with that song stuck in my head now, Father Abraham, we call him that because he was the father of many nations and like the father of faith, right? He really like kind of pushed that and showed how faith in God like will build an entire nation and for thousands and thousands of years, okay? So all of the greatness of the people that come before you is actually in your DNA, right? That Fibonacci sequence, the summation of all of their faith, all of their acts, and everything is inside of you. And you can use that and tap into that and go further and farther than they were able to, because you know what they know, right? And you can take what they know and you can build upon it, and you can get more revelation and more revelation. And I was talking with Pastor Nadine, who is one of the pastors at our church, and we were talking about with the Fibonacci sequence how quickly it gets larger, right? It starts off small and like in tiny, tiny rotations. But before you know it, it is going and spiraling, and it's super huge, right? Let me find that picture again. Right? Like this one with the shell, right? That center spiral, after one rotation, right? It started off as a point. Like it was at a point. And then it circled around, and after one rotation, it is absolutely huge, right? After it's gone like around once or twice, it is enormous. So that is kind of the importance of speaking the word of God, right? A lot of times we might only say things or believe things like one time, but you got to keep saying it. You got to keep speaking it. You got to keep building upon it, and it'll gain momentum, and it'll be huge before you even realize it. Like even after just a rotation, 360 is all that it takes. Okay? And it is completely different from everything that was before it. Like it took all of that and just kept going and kept going and kept going. So I think that that's pretty amazing, and it makes me super excited because I love math and I love seeing the patterns in it and like the logic in it and like the underlying structure that actually math has, right? I mean, all of these things, it goes from the galaxies down to seashells down to your DNA. I mean, there is a broad spectrum of things that it covers, and it's because it is built into energy. I saw this picture, I didn't get a chance to print it out, but it rearranges the periodic table in like a circle, right? Following like that spiral with the Fibonacci sequence. And it makes sense, right? A lot of the things still line up until you get to some of the more like man-made elements that are a little bit more unstable and different things. It's not perfect, but it makes a lot of sense because the atoms and like their influence keep getting larger and as they get bigger and bigger. And so even the elements follow this kind of pattern, right? Where it builds upon itself. So I encourage you to think about your future, right? And to think about the past as well, but think about the good things that have happened, right? And that's the things that you want to claim and build upon and move forward in. You don't got to think about all the bad things that have happened in the past and, oh, things are only going to get worse. I'm not talking about that, okay? Because all of these things that I showed you are good things, right? None of it's bad. Like sunflowers aren't like a bad thing because, oh, they go in a spiral. Like they're not getting worse, right? They only get better as they produce more seeds, okay? And they can spread their lovely sunshine, flowery faces all over the earth, okay? So I encourage you to think about the future and how you want your actions to affect the future. And then also think about what you can do knowing all of the things that have happened in the past, right? We don't want to repeat history. I mean, there's really no need to, right? We know what happened. We want to take that and use that to push us forward, but push us forward in the Word of God, okay? Because I'm sure some of you might be concerned about some of the things that are happening in the world. You don't have to be concerned about any of that, okay? All of that stuff is also in the Bible. This is not the first time this has happened. Hopefully it's the last, and if this is the last thing that happens, then we all get to go to heaven and be with Jesus, right? That's a whole nother video. But like I said, I just encourage you to kind of do some thinking and reflecting about like where you've come from and where you're going. And I think that's one of the reasons Jesus listed his genealogy in the Bible, right? Not only to show that he was of righteous descent through David and Abraham and all of those people, but also to show people his heritage, where he was from, right? His heritage of faith. And then from that point to kind of keep going. And basically that you can be accepted into the family of Jesus, right? And that's your future, right? And so looking at the Bible, the entire Bible is like your history. The entire Bible is like your family history, which that's just so amazing, okay? Well, comment, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Always feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or comments, or you want to share, how this has affected you. But I love you all, and Jesus does too.